Thank you very much, Maurice. And can I add my welcome to all of you here tonight, particularly our very distinguished guests and distinguished speakers who will introduce a little bit later. I'm really delighted that we're hosting this In Conversation event here at Queen's. It's been organised with our own Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice, and with our good friends, the Royal Ulster Constabulary George Cross Foundation. I've had the privilege of hosting last year's and being at the last couple of years of the RUC George Cross Foundation, and the challenging talks that we've been able to manage at those events have been really impressive. Queen's is committed to providing opportunities for public discussion of matters of significance locally and globally, even when those issues can be quite challenging. We have a very long-standing partnership with RUC GC Foundation, resulting in an annual lecture theatres, and we've had guest speakers from some of our local alumni, the PSNI Chief Constable Sir George Hamilton, counter-terrorism expert Ali Soufan, and last year Andrew Carpenter, the author of the United Nations Strategic Guidance Framework for International Policing. And we've learned much from all of those events. So we're very happy to be able to present this additional In Conversation event to complement the annual lecture series. The current geopolitical environment we find ourselves in really does result in this being very relevant to today. Challenging issues such as the maintenance of law and justice in divided societies have never been more important or germane for us. We have a surfeit of war and division in the present day, making this conversation, I think, not only relevant, but I'm sure it will be both thought-provoking and highly informed by our two international leaders who are highly experienced in this field and eminent experts. Dr. Barbara Stephenson is Vice Provost for Global Affairs and the Chief Global Officer at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She is a distinguished diplomat, former US ambassador, and former Dean of the Leadership and Management School at the Foreign Service Institute. Her nearly 34-year career as an American diplomat has included postings as the US ambassador to Panama and the first woman to serve as deputy ambassador and acting ambassador at the US Embassy in London. She also served as American Consul General in Belfast from 2001 to 2004, and really re-engaged fantastically with us when she supported the event we ran last year around the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. Sir Hugh Orde was Chief Constable in the Police Service for Northern Ireland from 2002 to 2009, and was President of the Association of Chief Police Officers from 2009 to 2015. He was awarded an OBE in 2001 for services to policing, and in 2005 was knighted for his work in this sector. In 2008, he was awarded the Annual Leadership Award from the Police Executive Research Forum, recognising again his work in changing policing in Northern Ireland following the Belfast Good Friday Agreement in 1998. And then in 2010, he was awarded the Queen's Police Medal for services to policing, recognising a career contribution to post-conflict policing, particularly in Northern Ireland. So I'm sure it's hard to think of two people better placed to address the questions of how policing and politics in divided societies can be made to work. And I thank both of them for agreeing to take part in this very important conversation. So you'll hear more from them in a moment, and from Dr. Peter McLoughlin from School of History, Anthropology, Philosophy and Politics at Queen's, who will chair the conversation. But for now, let me simply welcome our speakers, and it's my pleasure now to hand over to Mr. Michael Davidson, who's going to bring a message from the Royal Ulster Constabulary George Cross Foundation. So thank you very much, Michael.
Good evening, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's a privilege for me to be here tonight representing the Royal Ulster Constabulary George Cross Foundation. I'm here my main role is to introduce Mr. Stephen White, our chairperson, who's unable to attend. And I'm certainly hoping the weather's better where he is than it is here tonight. Mr. White has created a small video as an introduction, but before we play the video, I personally would like to thank Queen's University for organising this event and hosting this event. I'm sure it will be, as you've said, very thought-provoking and relevant and current in today's society. I'd also like to thank Queen's University for their continued support of the Royal Ulster Constabulary George Cross Foundation. The Foundation is very lucky to have both Queen's and Ulster University support us in our mandate of marking the sacrifices and honouring the achievements of the RUC George Cross. So without further ado, I think we'll play Stephen. He can speak much better than I can. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, as chairman of the Royal Ulster Constabulary GC Foundation, I'm really sorry I'm not there with you tonight for what will be, I know, a very special occasion. I want to give you the warmest of welcomes and thank you for taking the time to be present. I also want to thank a number of people, and that includes those from Queen's University who have helped to organise and enable this special event. To Peter McLoughlin in particular, thank you for the initiative. And of course, to our two speakers, I'd like to say a very warm welcome. I've known Sir Hugh since 1982, and I've had the privilege also of working alongside him in the senior management team of the Police Service of Northern Ireland. Like me, I know he appreciates the importance of marking the service and particularly the sacrifice of police colleagues. And he played a tremendous role as chair and now patron of the Police Arboretum Memorial Trust. The Royal Ulster Constabulary GC Foundation is dedicated to marking the sacrifices and honouring the achievements of the Royal Ulster Constabulary. And that also means learning. That also means ensuring that people understand the role of police in society and the need to support the rule of law. So I'm absolutely delighted that our other speaker, Dr. Barbara, has joined us here this evening. I've had the pleasure and privilege of working alongside Barbara on a number of occasions. I was there when she was the US Consul, and I know how much she supports the rule of law, human rights, and the need to reconcile and move forward in this country, but also beyond. When I was in the European Union as a head of mission, she referred many of her military colleagues before deployment to Iraq, and I deeply appreciated that. I want to thank her for taking the time to be with us this evening, and I look forward to listening online to all the contributions. So to all of you there, enjoy the evening. I'm sorry, as I said, I can't be with you, but good luck, and again, thank you for all your contributions.
Well, folks, thank you very much for those introductions. Thank you, everybody coming here today. And again, thank you to our two guests for coming for what will no doubt be a really interesting and important conversation about their respective roles here at a crucial time in our early peace process in the 2000s. So before I proceed, I thought it would be worthwhile a little bit to say something more of that very challenging time, to remind people of how difficult that early period of the peace process was, to help explain the focus of our discussion, particularly on policing reform, but also the very political, highly political context and challenging context in which that took place. So we already noted that Sir Hugh Orde was Chief Constable from 2002, and in taking up that role at that time, he really was taking on one of the most challenging policing leadership roles there was. As we've noted, policing reform came out of the Belfast or Good Friday Agreement. There had already been a commission appointed as part of that under Chris Patten, and so I'll be referring at different times to the Patten reforms or the Patten process. And that had already begun under the RUC having its name changed to the Police Service of Northern Ireland under Sir Ronnie Flanagan, who was Sir Hugh Orde's predecessor. So that process had already begun, but Sir Hugh was coming in then to continue and bring about the many more changes that were part of the Patten process to fully deliver on that. However, it wasn't straightforward. For many unionists, for the DUP particularly, were opposed to a lot of these changes, opposed even to the change in the name that had already taken place. For many RUC officers even had issues with the changing of the name. On the other hand, you had Sinn Féin and many nationalists feeling that this reform process wasn't radical enough, didn't go anywhere near far enough. So this alone should explain something of the very polarised and challenging context in which Sir Hugh Orde was taking on the role of Chief Constable and continuing that process. He had to be ever mindful of the powerful politics at play at a time when the peace process was in its infancy and when its overall direction was still contested by different parties. Now, Ambassador Stephenson, her role was in some ways similar, in some ways different. She obviously represented the US government's interest in Northern Ireland, which had really reached a high point with the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, not least in the fact that Senator George Mitchell had been the chair of the talks and, of course, is the patron of the Mitchell Institute, so quite rightly one of the co-partners today, had helped bring about that historic breakthrough. But of course it had to be implemented now. This was just as challenging as Senator Mitchell recognised. And policing was just one of many issues that was very contested as part of that process. So Ambassador Stephenson was coming into a role to ensure that the agreement, of which the US was in some ways an effective guarantor of, that it delivered on the real change that it had promised. Now, obviously, the US government wanted to be seen as an honest broker in that process, but it wasn't seen that way by all parties. Historically, I think it's fair to say that a lot of unionists would tend to see the US role as being driven by Irish America and therefore pursuing a pro-nationalist or even pro-Republican agenda. Even moderate nationalists like the SDLP really did argue that it was crucial the US had played this part in the agreement process, that had helped deliver to oblige the British government and unionists to make the concessions that they had in the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement. So again, Ambassador Stephenson had this very difficult balancing role, that on the one hand you had a lot of nationalists that were expecting the US to play this role in delivering on real change through the Good Friday Agreement, and on the other hand you understandably had a lot of unionists who were anxious about where this radical reform process would eventually lead to. So not an easy balancing act for either Ambassador Stephenson or Sir Hugh Orde in their respective roles. Before I get on some of the really challenging questions around that, though, I'm going to start with an easier one, get us started. So it's really just to both of you, what made you accept our invitation to come back here and speak in Northern Ireland today? So maybe we'll start, you've travelled the furthest, Ambassador Stephenson. So what made you accept the invitation to come back and speak about Northern Ireland?
Well, Peter, it's never a really hard sell to get me to come back to Belfast, so we should just acknowledge that. I loved my 3 years here, and then I appreciated the chance when I was the minister in London of being able to come back over. But I really reflected last year when we were all gathered here to look at the 25th anniversary, and you had so many prime ministers. You had the Taoiseach, you had President Clinton, you had former Secretary Clinton. And, you know, we're reaching the point where we look back on decades of work as diplomats, and so much of what we worked on unraveled. And there was such a sense on the 25th anniversary that the peace agreement in Belfast, which had been hard to reach And it was very delicate during those early years. As you say, it wasn't clear how it would turn out, that it was one of the more successful and enduring things that we got to work on in our entire careers. And I think particularly, and this is really what I wanted to come back to talk about, especially with the RUC GC Foundation here and the Mitchell Institute, I think it's the most successful example of police reform in a post-conflict situation that I can think of anywhere in the world. I came here after working on the peace process in El Salvador, and the peace kind of held in a certain way, et cetera, but the police reform, we didn't get that right. The security services were abolished, and a crime wave came in, and gang violence took over in a way that El Salvador never recovered from. Northern Ireland, on the other hand, the police service of Northern Ireland, through the Patton report, going through all of those step-by-step reforms, the RUC underwent profound transformation from a paramilitary force that was overwhelmingly Protestant to a police service of Northern Ireland that won the support of all parts of the community. And there was never a serious breakdown in law and order or of governance. That is a real achievement. I just read the survey that came out in May 2022 of attitudes toward the police to see if the policing board commissioned it. And some 90% of respondents said they felt entirely comfortable calling the PSNI if they needed them. 49% gave it the most extreme version of course I would call the PSNI. And repeatedly I found, on questions that there would be no statistical difference based on this, that, the other thing, and religion. This is a big transformation, and there are issues, there always is, getting policing right and keeping policing healthy, but I can't think of a more successful example of police reform, and I think it is, first of all, I hope the RUC George Cross Foundation these were hard sacrifices, and I hope that being the best and having pitched in and done a reform process that was unbelievably difficult is part of what can be commemorated and celebrated. And I also just, I believe that leading change like this in a government institution, it almost always fails. It is unbelievably difficult. And I really tip my hat to Hugh Orde, who was one of the most effective long-term change leaders I ever knew in all the years I worked on change leadership. So that's why I came back.
So same opening question to you, Sir Hugh. What made you accept our invitation to come back here?
Well, thank you, and I'll pay you later for that comment, Barbara. Thank you. Barbara touched on the 25-year dinner at Hillsborough Castle. I was lucky enough to be there as well. There are some really key players at that meeting, at that dinner, people who made a massive difference. And Liz Truss, which I could never quite work out, to be quite honest. But the reason I came back was, I love this place. I enjoyed working here. Barbara's made some very kind comments. And the point about leading change of that magnitude against the complex political backdrop we were dealing with can only be done with a team effort. And so the notion that one person can do that is flawed. I was very lucky. I had a very effective team of senior leaders, all of whom were different, and that was their biggest strength. And also, I had an extraordinarily well-trained service, because one thing Patton didn't do was change the officers. The officers who were Royal Ulster Constabulary George Cross on day PS9-1 were exactly the same people who became Police Service and Northern Ireland officers on the first day of the new service, which was a change led by my predecessor, as Barbara rightly points out, and that was, don't underestimate the difficulty of changing a name. So I inherited an organisation that was about to embark on one of the biggest reform programmes in modern policing history. But if you've got the bottom end keen to take opportunity and the top end keen to drive change, then you've got a recipe that is likely to be successful. And so that's why I'm back, plus I had absolutely nothing else to do today, so I'm very pleased to be here.
Nonetheless, thank you very much. And so, second question would be, Patton was all about community policing. And there's obviously two elements to that, the community and the policing. In some ways, you're slightly preempting this question of what I was going to ask you there, Sir Hugh. But I was going to ask, how important were the various police personnel that you worked with or led in this process? So maybe particularly you would want to talk a bit more about that, Sir Hugh, but equally feel free to. Then the second point was the communities, and I think Ambassador Stephenson, you might be able to comment more about how important communities were in helping to bring about this move to community policing post-conflict Northern Ireland. So I'm thinking particularly of ordinary citizens, of people on the ground, community workers, and even the independent policing board members, the non-political appointees. So again, both the police personnel, or for either of you, the police actual officers that you dealt with, but also the ordinary community representatives. How important were both of those? So maybe to start with.
So I want to talk about people, but I first really want to talk about that most boring of all words, process, right? It's the patent process. And Hugh, you can talk about this more than I can, but it felt to me like the right steps, and then it was a checkbox kind of an operation. And so before you were going to have your review, 6 week people would pull it out of the bottom of the inbox, they'd decide what it was they were going to be able to make progress on, and it was bureaucratically brilliant. It understood how bureaucracies work. And I think it's really one of the things to study, because it didn't just proclaim an end state, it proclaimed a whole series of steps that if you took them and you took them together, they would constitute this change. I think that was remarkable. So I think the patent process is really something to reflect on. I think the people who stepped forward to work on the policing board, and the central one, as well as around the country for the independent ones around the district policing boards. This was the big thing that was happening when I got here. I arrived in August of 2001, and I think it was in November that the policing board was formed. So this was, and nobody expected it to work. As you will all recall, politics weren't working, Stormont collapsed, and the policing board had to carry all of that. It was all the politics part. But I would call out, I'd call out Dennis Bradley as one of the real heroes of this. I remember how remarkable it was when he stepped forward to take this, and he wrote a terrific piece where he explained why I decided to do this. Why does somebody with my background and my community affiliation think it's time that we move into being a properly policed society? And my staff said, you know, this is somebody you really might want to get to know. And then I remember Mary McCrae, who joined the district policing board, and then her van was vandalized and burned, and her husband's wheelchair lift was destroyed. And it was a discouraging moment about whether citizens were going to be able to step forward and do these district policing boards. And Dennis Bradley went on the radio and talked about, she said when they asked her would she step down, she said no, of course not, which was kind of inspiring. And then Dennis came on and amplified it, and then I got Mary McCrae invited to the White House, and the president actually called her out as this is the kind of, you know, a society that produces people like Mary McCrae deserves a successful policing reform. So it was really inspiring. So people took risks. They took real risks, and they felt unsafe, and they did it anyway in order to bring this about. So I think the community part of this should never be played down.
Mm-hmm. And so equally, so you mentioned a little bit about the policing team around you, but ordinary officers or ordinary people in the community, what were your memories of this and how important they were in delivering the pattern process?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure there's anything, I don't know how you describe officers. Ordinary probably isn't the phrase I would use. They were extraordinary. You need both. You need the community to give us a chance, and you need police officers to take a risk. And this was policing is a risk business, or it was. I'm not so sure it is now. Policing is a risk. So we had to, first of all, get the team in place, and as Barbara rightly identified, the bureaucracy was bizarrely important and something I hate doing, but it was important. We had oversight coming. I had more oversight than I could shake a stick at, including an international advisory board, review board, which was made up mainly of American and Canadian retired police officers. Most of the recruitment requirements were you had to be at least 75, and have some experience of policing. And they managed to turn 175 recommendations that Lord Patton created into 772 performance indicators. And I reckon I could have delivered all of those and ticked a box and delivered nothing. What we had to do had to be far more real than simply mechanical. So it was a combination of the two. But we also needed to empower our front line and convince our local commanders that the move from what had to be a fairly rigid structure, because that's how you kept people alive during what we call the Troubles in terms of procedures to keep our officers safe so they could do their job, to allow them the freedom to move forward at different speeds in different places, because peace processes are messy, endgames and terrorism are messy. So what may have worked in one part of Northern Ireland would not have worked in another. So we had to have this sort of, as I called it, chaos, this chaotic approach that was the only way we were going to allow to push people forward. And in terms of successes, in terms of stories, I remember speaking to a sergeant in Newry just before he was retiring, having done literally 30 years in Newry. And I just said to him, what's different? He said, well, now, so he said, I can walk into, he said, before I couldn't walk into certain shops. He said, now I can walk into every shop on my beat. I hadn't told him to do that. He had made a decision that I will push edges and see what happens. And it was those sorts of stories that move the world on, not what we did at the centre. So you needed really empowered frontline officers led by commanders who were prepared to take a risk and accept things would go wrong. And they certainly did, and you've got a list of them you're going to ask me about later, so I won't jump the gun on those. But you take a step forward and you take half a step back, and then you move forward again. And that's how police reform, effective police reform, works. You also have to acknowledge the accountability. Barbara's touched on that, hugely important. But communities were important too. The district policing partnerships, another pattern reform, really important, because it gave local accountability at a level the public could really see and feel. You know, these things were public meetings. The police board was a public meeting. It was filmed. You know, we were live on television being held to account by those who represented their communities. And at the beginning, of course, Sinn Féin wouldn't join the party for a bit. Mm-hmm. Eventually they did, and the reason they did was they had no choice, because the world was moving ahead of them. And you know, now we have, you know, senior Sinn Féin members attending police passing out parades. Mm-hmm. You know, the world has moved on. So you need both, is, you know, long and short. You need a good leadership team that's absolutely committed and as one. You need frontline officers prepared to take risk. You need local commanders prepared to take risk and allow their people to take risk. And you need a public that's prepared to give us a chance. And if you get that opportunity and you make a difference, that's what goes around communities. You know, officers actually turned up and made a difference. You know, the first time someone's called a cop in 20 or 30 years, give us a chance. If it works, that's how you move the world on.
And maybe just picking up on that point, that Sinn Féin's changing political position as well. Of course, we shouldn't forget that the political context was constantly and quite monumentally changing in the time that you were here. So I'm thinking at a global and a local level. So I'll start with the local because it follows from what you were saying there, Sir Hugh. So not long into the job, you had the situation where the SDLP and the UUP, who were the real key negotiators of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, were overtaken by Sinn Féin and the DUP in the 2003 election as the main representatives by the two communities. And so to remind you, as we've noted there, Sinn Féin didn't accept the policing arrangements that were in place, and the DUP didn't accept the Good Friday Agreement at all, didn't accept the changes that had already happened, the change of the name to the PSNI and so on. So how did that, first of all, and I'll come back to the global context, how did that really important political shift at a local level, how did that affect the way you went about the job?
Well, and the short answer is it didn't, because the moment the police start playing with the politics is you're on the road to disaster. And this is at a sort of more, at a national level, if you see now the politicisation of policing, less so here, but you have the rest of the United Kingdom is now, with the exception of London, you have an individual elected police and crime commissioner holding the chief constable to account. And the famous phrase from the then Home Secretary Theresa May was, these people will hire and fire chief constables. And the moment you bring it so close is the moment the thing falls apart. There's a very famous judgment, which I used to use all the time, if only to annoy the Home Secretary when I met her. R.V. Blackburn, which is a 1968 case where the Master of the Rolls, a man called Lord Denning, an extraordinary legal mind, observed that the police answer to the law and the law alone. That was my benchmark for 38 years, including the 7 here. I answered to the law, not to politicians. What we did was what we had to do effective policing and keep people safe. And that was based on all the pattern recommendations, the human rights-based approach to policing, all the investment in training, a code of ethics, a completely different discipline code, a completely different accountability structure to anywhere else in Europe, if not further apart, further afield. And by keeping to those principles and doing the policing, the fallout from what we did was a matter for politicians to deal with. So when, for example, we did quite early in my career, we searched Stormont and caused a bit of a furore, to say the least. I was actually on a plane to London to meet the then Northern Ireland Secretary John Reid when that actually happened. So I was at 30,000 feet. When I landed, I went to 50,000 feet because this thing had happened. And I came straight back and said, no, we got that wrong. Not the search, but the search, we did the search in the wrong way. The right of police to investigate allegations of serious crime and search places is absolute. What we hadn't thought through was the world had moved on and we were still stuck doing a search as we had always done a search, because that's how we could keep our people safe and carry out the job. So we simply hadn't transitioned quickly enough. The public will forgive a mistake, and it was a mistake. The officers did exactly as they were told, actually. It wasn't a failure of frontline, it was a failure of management. The officers did exactly as they were told, and they did it as well as they possibly could. We just did it in the wrong way. The public will forgive a mistake, they will not forgive a cover-up. And no one learns. We don't learn that we don't learn, and you see this time and time again in policing. But we very quickly said we were sorry. In fact, some of the first questions I got were from America rather than number 10. It was that interesting, because we were very conscious the whole time I was there that we were in the eye of this peace process storm, if you like. Policing was the thing. The politicians couldn't agree it, even if George Mitchell's best efforts. The agreement was it would go to a separate inquiry, a report, and everyone would sign up to the report. Now, some signed up and some didn't, matter for them, but that was the process. And we then delivered the report.
And then at a global level as well, Ambassador Stephenson, you mentioned that you arrived here in August 2001. So literally within weeks of that, you had, from a US perspective, the absolute tragedy of 9/11 and how that, obviously as an American, how profoundly that would have affected you. Yeah. But of course that changed the world as well. It had an enormous global shift came about through that as well. Did that, happening so early as you arrived here in Belfast, did that in any way frame your attitude or your approach to the job?
I think I had to resist almost what the natural framing would be, right? You might remember after 9/11, which I think happened on a Tuesday afternoon here, and then that Friday or Saturday, maybe Friday, we all had a huge gathering in front of Belfast City Hall. And I ended my remarks by calling on us that the grief that unites us today would be channeled into lasting reconciliation, because nothing could do more to, for all the people in America who love this place and its people to heal the hurt we were feeling now. And I tried to stay in that space as we, as a government, went into a pretty vengeance is mine, and we will bring people to justice kind of a mode. And I actually turned down my first remark, my draft remarks that my team prepared for me were about going and, finding the people who had done this and bringing them to justice. And I thought, I'm here to bring about reconciliation. I'm here to support a fragile peace process that is losing Protestant support in particular at this time, and to shore it up and to see it through, because we've made a huge commitment and this matters to us. So I fought that trend, right? And then there is a little bit of a story that I'm going to just use this occasion to set right, which is there's an idea that on 9/11 we discovered the dangers of coddling terrorists. And I always just like to remind people of the historical fact that Richard Haas was our peace envoy at the time, and he was actually doing one of his London, Dublin, Belfast rounds when 9/11 happened. So he was in London first on September 10. And what were we worried about? We were worried about the IRA providing mortar technology, mortars, to the FMLN guerrillas in Colombia in a way that was just overwhelming the police's ability to defend themselves. And we were working on that before I came out to post. This was the big issue in August when I was doing my briefing. And then he spoke on September 10 on Millbank about how this was one of the key things he had to take up during his visit to Belfast. So he flew over to Dublin and he did his meetings there, and then the attacks started, and we didn't have cell phones at the same way. And so when he got here, I picked him up at the train station. I remember he said to me, "Is the White House still standing?" So this just tells you how shocking it was. And I said, "Yes, it is. The Pentagon's hit, people are fleeing on foot, but the White House is still standing." So it was very profound. We went on in his amazing way. He insisted that we go ahead with all of our meetings with the political parties. So everybody was rolling through. So he decided to take a call before we did our meeting with Sinn Féin. So I went into our little office and the little black and white TV, and with Jerry Adams and Martin McGuinness behind me, for the first time watched the towers collapse. So it was everybody says, "Where were you on 9/11?" And that was where I was. We became, at home, our police force became less community policing and more militarized and SWAT-like as a result of 9/11 and all of the heavy equipment that was provided to the police. And yet our job here was to encourage the opposite trend, dropping all that heavy equipment, going to bicycles, no face coverings with your name tags out, and genuine community policing. So we worked at odds almost with what the external framework was. And then the other place we weighed in, I never felt, the DUP probably didn't love the Patton report and the change from the RUC, but nor did they ever tell the members of the population who voted for them not to be part of the police force. So the impact of that was rather modest, but the impact of Sinn Féin remaining outside the policing order became ever more pressing. And that really became, I think, the big place where the United States weighed in. And, at a certain point, we'll get to this, but really, I think made ourselves not terribly welcome even at number 10 as we pressed as hard as we did to hold Sinn Féin's feet to the fire and say, it's time now. It's time to join the new policing order. And so, White House visits were not offered. Instead, the McCartney sisters were received, so we sent some powerful messages in the end about that. That was, so while we were going on with 9/11 and becoming, quite militarized back in the United States, what our mission here is to encourage this police force in an entirely different direction. And we put a lot into it.
Okay. And you mentioned there the McCartney sisters, and so I'm now with my next question. I'm going to, I know, Ambassador Stephenson, you weren't here for all of these events, but I'm just going to, again, remind people of just how many profoundly political events or episodes took place that in many ways intersected with politics, okay? So really explaining again the title of what we're discussing today, policing and politics. So you had the PSNI physically going into Stormont, making those arrests. Of course, that was related to allegations of Sinn Féin and spying, and not just that, you had the various allegations of criminality and paramilitarism. So you had the Castlereagh break-in, you had the Northern Bank robbery, you had the killing of Robert McCartney, so you're referring to the sisters there, and their very brave role there afterwards. You then had the additional challenge of the PSNI having to investigate past the issues relating to the troubles of the past, which included, of course, investigations into allegations of the state and collusion, so including actors like the police. So there was that challenging difficulty as well. And throughout all of this, you had, and I'm thinking particularly of you at this point, Sir Hugh, you had a constant threat from not just Republicans, but primarily from dissident Republicans, a threat for further terrorism, and for particularly to the public and to your officers. And of course you had, most notably, the horrific, tragic killing of Constable Carroll in 2009. So there's a whole series of kind of events, episodes there. The question is really, how did you keep this process moving forward when there were so many challenges? So maybe start with you, Sir Hugh, on that one.
Yeah. Well, the 9th of March 2009 was probably the worst day of my policing career when Stevie was murdered. First PSNI officer murdered by distant Republican terrorists but in a way, it answers your question, because Stevie was part of a team working in an area where we knew the risk was high, we had good intelligence, risk was high, that's why Stevie was there. He was part of a support group so officers could local officers deliver effective policing, knowing they were being looked after by their colleagues, and Stevie was killed as he went to a call to provide that support. But that was the point, they went towards the danger, knowing the risk was high, in an area where the risk was high. Very difficult as chief, because all you do is, all I can do, or my senior team could do, is make sure the frontline officers had every scrap of intelligence we had, so they knew the context. But you'll never stop frontline officers going to calls for help. And that's a sort of consistent theme of what the cops do. So all the issues all the events you've talked about, some were politically driven, some were criminally driven, some were just events because policing is a complex process. The bank robbery sort of springs from that. It's another bad day in the office. But the response was quite interesting. We changed the banknotes, first time it's ever been done in a police investigation. The money's never appeared. The vast majority of that money has never appeared. So we did some really different and interesting things, and that was a bright idea from one of our frontline detectives. Why don't you change the banknotes? My job was to get the thing done, which is a story in itself, which I won't bore you with, but we pulled it off with government support, and turned, it enabled me to use one of my I got told off using one line, so I said it was the biggest theft of waste paper in criminal history, because it was. So you ride the storm, and you do what cops do, is you investigate. We investigated Castlereagh. I hasten to add, it was before my time, but you investigate the bank robbery, but you investigate to the very best of your ability. We didn't get a conviction, but we did investigate. We did what the cops did, and the rest of it sort of worked around us. The politics are worked around what the police were doing, but you have to be relentless in delivering the change programme, and you can't just deliver change. I was lucky, I inherited a report. We had the starting point, which was the pattern report. So my job was to actually deliver something that someone far brighter than I could ever be had written with a team after a lot of time, a lot of expertise. It was implementation, but of course implementation in the public sector is where so many things crash and burn. Mm-hmm. So we had to be relentless, and we had to ride those storms. And I said it was one step forward, you get a bank robbery, half a step back, you push forward again, and you just keep driving forward. You had your whole command team, we divided the whole report up, because you had to deliver always in parallel, otherwise we'd still be implementing it, we'd be on about recommendation 40. We had to do 175, so different police leaders, some of whom are in the audience today, who will no doubt correct me later if I get it wrong, but we just drove the whole thing forward, and my job was just to provide them with the support. But we did have support. Before we talk, the importance of the international dimension should never be underestimated in delivering reforms such as these. I'm still persuaded, but I don't think Sinn Féin would have jumped when they did if it wasn't for American pressure. That's simply a fact. The involvement of George Mitchell in the process, the involvement, the real interest in the senior American leadership and what was going on was very important. My job was, of course, to make sure that those making observations on policing in Northern Ireland from America, the Republicans, as I used to call them, were informed. And I wouldn't have got two young police officers to meet the President of the United States and tell them what they were doing, which was good policing, without Barbara. But those things were hugely symbolic and sent such clear messages to the politicians. It wasn't about us doing politics, it was about us providing information and allowing others to make judgments.
Would you agree with those comments, the idea that the US, particularly, and you mentioned there the McCartney sisters, and there was the famous episode of their being invited to the White House, Gerry Adams' visa on that occasion, it wasn't invited. So did these kind of things what was your memory of these events, and do you agree with Sir Hugh Wood's point there about US was very important in pushing Sinn Féin towards accepting reformed policing?
I sure would. I would. And it wasn't an easy time, because it was not only uncomfortable sometimes with Sinn Féin leadership, it was also wasn't always comfortable with number 10, and this is our closest ally in the great big geopolitical sense. And so, the US and the UK, you need to be, and we didn't see completely eye to eye on this. We really did think it was time. And so we used up some capital on that. And I was reminded by Peter McKittrick in the consulate. I talked to senior women in policing about 10 years ago, and we pulled up my talk. And it was really precarious. I mean, whether this was going to really hold and work was by no means a foregone conclusion. And I think the pressure, the question after McCartney's murder and the cover-up, which was tough, right? And just the criminality, because it was not just the Northern Bank robbery, but before that, in May, Hugh, the macro heist happened. And there was a lot of theft from that too. And I do remember asking, well, who do you think did that? Because it was a really sophisticated heist, and there was really only one answer about who could have pulled these things off. So that phase where we started to put pressure and to raise, just press that it was time for Sinn Féin to join. It was a difficult period, and we used up political capital in a whole lot of ways as we pressed for that. But why did we get through this? It was this just relentless half step back, we're going to do a step forward, and you just kept at it, Hugh. And one of the things I was doing, because we had sanctions is too strong, but we had probably sanctions in American legislation where they had found the RUC guilty of human rights abuses, and so there were negative things written into some legislation, and that we managed to turn our Congress around and get them behind PSNI reform and the idea that the police service of Northern Ireland needed our support, not, our opprobrium. And we used time series polling on this that came out regularly. And the one that we looked at all the time was, how did it break down the answer to the question, the police service of Northern Ireland protects me and my community? And we started to get more than 50% of the nationalist demographic, the Catholic demographic, agreeing with that statement, even after these shocks. The shocks would happen, and you'd have to go in and do a tough enforcement, and it was holding up. And that was the first sign that we argued back. This is real indication that the reform is real. They're winning support across the nationalist community, and they're able to do it through really difficult shocks that kept happening. But it would hold up in the polling. You could see it. The people of Northern Ireland were starting to believe that the police reform was real. That's how I read it.
So one of the things we also try to do here at Queen's, and it's implicit in the title, is try to think about Northern Ireland in relation to other divided societies. So a question to you now both would be, you've both done a lot of work since your time in Northern Ireland, speaking in other contexts where there's similarly ethnic division or security problems. Ambassador Stephenson, you'd already mentioned your time in El Salvador, which was before your posting in Northern Ireland. So I suppose my question on this is, do we need to be careful? Do we sometimes oversimplify things to suggest that Northern Ireland is a model, or that it has lessons for other conflict regions, when some of these conflict regions will be much more deprived, they'll have experienced much more catastrophic levels of violence, have more hostile neighbours and so on? Do we need to be careful about this idea that while we've done a lot right here, how we talk about a Northern Ireland model or lessons for other regions? So Hugh?
Look, what you can't do and is simply take the pattern report off the shelf, go to, it doesn't matter, Cameroon, Colombia, Burma, wherever, in the world there's a problem, and say, here's what you need. What you can do is you can go and share your experiences. I remember quite soon after I retired from the chief officer, after the job, when I finally retired, in 2015, I spent a week in the jungle in the Philippines, down in the Bangsamoro, with a senior politician and an ex-IRA man from here, talking to the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, who were on ceasefire and looking and wondering what to do with their army, because it was an army. They've been fighting for decades, when they stopped fighting. And their idea was, well, we can make them into the police service, which would have been tricky because it wasn't, the area was mixed. There was quite a large Christian community and all the complexities that would involve. So we went and just told them what we did. Of course, that wasn't ever part of a pattern view, but we told our story. and they found that helpful in terms of what they were going to do next. But like so many of these peace processes, that fell apart. So there was a massive firefight between the police and the army and the terrorists, and it all went back 3 or 4 years. And that's the point. The point is Endgames in Terror. It's a very good book written by Orde Cronin, an American academic, on how terrorism ends. And she observes that 90% or 99% of terrorist insurgencies going back hundreds of years have been solved by negotiation. There's hardly any examples of state force winning an insurgency battle over time. Negotiation resolves insurgencies. But she also makes the observation that endgames are messy, and they are. So the notion that you can just go and give them something is flawed at every level. But this is seen universally as an interesting and successful peace process, not just the policing bit, the whole process. So it would be wrong to keep that to ourselves. We should share it if asked. I'm not a believer in imposing ourselves on anyone, but if someone says we are interested in what you are doing, then we should go and tell our story, and then they can take what they want, dismiss the whole thing. I've been universally unsuccessful wherever I've been. We have not moved the world on hugely, but we may have moved it on that much in 5 years' time, because they'll just remember something that was said and go back to it and look at it, put it into their context and move the world on slightly. And if you can do that, then the net result of any end game in terrorism is that you keep people alive. And the best benchmark of that, when people are asked the difficult questions about, well, you spoke to terrorists, you did this, you did that, all these bad people got out of prison early, except, the list goes on. You go to a book called Lost Lives, which I'm sure most people know in this room, written by some extraordinary journalists, and who update it now and again, sadly. And you look at the stats in the back, and you look at deaths pre-Good Friday Agreement and deaths post-Good Friday Agreement. That is the reason for talking.
Exactly. And a reminder, Ambassador Stephenson, so do we need to be careful about this idea of a Northern Ireland model or lessons for other regions which have their own unique, sometimes more profound, challenging situation?
So I don't really think we have to be careful about it. I think we have to be aware that it may not be enough and it may not work, but I see no serious downside in studying the success of police reform in Northern Ireland as part of a comprehensive peace process. And I think there are so few positive models of this to study. There's so much that can be seen, that can be learned. And the Mitchell Institute is here. And this is where young people who are starting to, see themselves as the peacemakers tomorrow, the ones who will bring people together to have these kinds of peace talks and talking to terrorists. Going in with some kind of a framework about how it worked here is all upside. You're going to have to adapt it. You might be able to adapt it perfectly and still have a firefight between the army and the police and bring the whole thing down. But I don't think it does any harm. I can't almost see a circumstance in which it does harm. I mean, you have many advantages here. Really good school system, really well-educated people, just the finest quality of public service that I've ever seen. Your civil servants are of an exceptional quality here. You aren't going to find that in a developing country. But I don't think that there's a risk of studying the process here. I think that there's all upside, and it would give you some kinds of things like, you got to really be careful about answering the call that will happen in as conflicts come to a close, to completely dissolve a police force or security service that has got human rights violations against its name, because you'll create a vacuum during that period. And I think getting young people to start to think through that part, that human rights violations, they're not just committed by the state. When you end up in a place where you have a policing void and you've got gangs running the shops in the downtown and the streets, women and children and sick people and elderly people and the poor, they all suffer enormously from those. So I think that there are lessons in here about justice. People here don't think they really got justice in some ways about the things that were done during the Troubles, but we got peace. As you say, Hugh, I mean, you can look at the numbers of people that died before the Good Friday Agreement. And, 25, when we were here for the 25th anniversary, the people who stick most with me are the peace babies I met. And they really want you to know, I'm in my 20s now, and I grew up with no living memory of any violence, of any sectarian violence in Northern Ireland. And I think that is why you do it. That's why you make some sacrifices and you give up things that you hold dear. It is actually to give that space of time for a generation to grow up that knows no violence. But my God, there's nothing easy about that. But I don't see downside to studying this. I don't think we have to be careful, but it isn't like it's a manual and you can hand it over and it's one size fits all. It's going to need all kinds of use, but the lessons that are here are really worth studying.
Thank you. I've got plenty more questions here, but I'm anticipating that there'll be a good number from the floor as well. So what I'm going to do is in that anticipation, I'm going to move over to the floor now. So are we ready to do that? Are we in a position? We are. Okay. What I might say at the outset here is probably got a bit more of a diverse audience than usual because, of course, we've got the usual of staff and students here. We've also got members of the policing family, past and present. So maybe it'd be useful if people can just say your name and what you represent and give you a question, and we'll see how we go with that. So there's going to be 2 microphones going around. So if you do want a question, I can see some hands going up straight away. If we could direct over here, I think we've got a. Yeah, there's the first hand I saw there to go up. By one of
Thank you.
Politicians.
Yes. Mike Nesbitt, I am now a former political member of the policing board. Great to see the two of you in the city. Thank you so much. Question for Sir Hugh. You said earlier that policing should embrace risk-taking, and then you went on to say, but you're not so sure that's happening now. Could you expand on that, Sir Hugh, and include your assessment of the implications for delivering a first-class service?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. It's good to see you again. And I remember those policing board days. Well, look, it seems to me that the learning for me was when I was here, we thought it was critical to empower our frontline leadership, to empower their frontline officers to do the job in the context of which they were operating. So you can have all sorts of rules and regulations and policies and procedures which may work or may not work. But you've got to get to a point where the frontline officer has the confidence to look at a situation and mindful of, when you call the cops, you're in a crisis. So a police officer will turn up, they've got to make a decision based on some information, no information, misleading information, or downright lies. They've got a split second to make that judgment and try and make a difference. And the more you can strain them with procedure and policy, the less chance they have of making a meaningful difference for that bespoke situation. And I think what's happened, I know, because in some of the cases we had here, officers made extraordinarily, what one could call brave decisions. They could have gone wrong. 99% of the time they don't, because cops are well trained, they know what they're doing. But the trick is, on the 1% that go wrong, is not to then react in a way that, you nail the poor officer to the floor and say, it's gone wrong, therefore it's your fault. Policing is an imprecise science. It isn't a science, it's as much an art as it is a science, and you've got to allow that judgment. We had, one of the other great things we had was a code of ethics, which was brought in during my time. It was written by, or it was worked on by one of my ACCs, Sam Kincaid, a double first from here, actually, in law. It was the first code of ethics in the country, and what it described was, this is how we will police. So if you're a frontline officer, it's not you must do regulation 2, line 3, do this. It was operate in that way. And if you operate in that way and you make the right decisions, and you make a decision for the right reasons and it goes wrong, we will not crucify you, we will support you, and if you need training, we will train you. Different mindset. What I think you see now is an increasing view, is a culture of blame. This rather transcends my time here. When I took over ACPO, there was a very clear sense that the police service was above its station, to put it in a better way, and the Home Secretary was brought in to give us a good spanking. And as a consequence of that, you saw all sorts of changes in policing done to the police, not with the police. So police reform was something done to the police, whereas historically it had been done with us because we were quite happy to change, and here is a case study in change. And things like policing crime commissions came in, politicisation of policing. The line between policing and politics got more and more blurred. And therefore it became a point where if you got something wrong, you were highly likely as a chief to get fired. And some chiefs were fired, many unlawfully, or some unlawfully, as was proved post-event, but that doesn't really help you if your chief has got fired. So I think people became risk-averse and started to stick to policy and procedure. And it was summed up to me by an officer from another force when I was ACPO, who said, well, sir, it's like this. It's better to fail by sticking to policy than to succeed by taking a risk. The point he was making was, if I stick to the policy, I know it won't work, but the policy is what I've got to do, rather than if I just do that differently, I'll probably fix it, but it might go wrong. I think that's the point. If you see it, and you see it from the top, senior police officers now seem to be completely incapable of speaking unless they've got a note in front of them to camera written by a 12-year-old. It is not a way of communicating with the public. The public don't trust someone who's simply reading something because all we see is the top of their head. It's because they're terrified they might say something that is not on script. So we'll have the script, therefore we'll do this, we'll tell the public through the media, this happened, that happened, because I've read it and that's safe, rather than actually humanize it and say how they feel. And policing is a very human interaction, and police officers have a right to express that when they are communicating as professionals. I think that's gone. I think that transcends right way down the line.
Thank you. The question is a very clear hand up there at the back. Can you see that? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Kieran McAvoy from the Mitchell Institute. Hugh, nice to see you. Barbara, nice to see you again. My question is, it's about the role of intelligence and intelligence coming into the public domain as part of a transition. So I spoke at an event in New York last week with the former Chief Justice of the Colombian Constitutional Court, and we were talking about armed groups ending, basically comparing the IRA to FARC. And one of the questions that he was reflecting on was, how does the public know what's actually happening? So both of you have talked about the bumps along the road in terms of our peace process, and you see a murder that's committed, or you see a robbery that happens, and the public are asking themselves, well, what's happening here? Like, is this all falling apart? And I said, and actually I was quoting you, Hugh, at one stage, I said, well, one of the things that happened in our transition was that at times the police made public their intelligence assessment about the direction of travel. In effect, saying to the public, this is a bump on the road, this is terrible and will be properly investigated and so forth, but our intelligence is that the direction of travel for this particular armed group is X or Y. So, and it may be relevant as a question for you as well, Barbara, for diplomats, but it's about that, about how you make the determinations what intelligence assessments are going to be made public in a transition.
You want to go first?
If
thanks, it's good to see you. Well, first of all, I think the more transparent and open you can be, the better. So we had what I call this principle of maximum transparency. And the point is really, if you look at policing generally, there is very little that is actually secret. Very little. And the only reason you should keep something secret is if it's in the public interest, not in the police interest. And I think historically, it's very easy to keep stuff quiet or keep stuff out of the public domain, say, oh, it's police business, nothing to do with you. Most of it actually is very much to do with the public. And the more the public know and the more the public understand the challenges facing policing, the more supportive they will be. On intelligence specifically, on groups, I think we were very lucky to have that independent group, whose name I've forgotten now. We had so many groups chaired by Lord Alderdice, John Grieve and co on, who would make independent assessments. I think there's something about independence that's really important. It's rather like the fact we have a police ombudsman here. When I was here, Nuala alone was a police ombudsman, fiercely independent, investigated every single complaint about the police, nothing to do with the police, really important. And if Nuala said something, people would accept it because it was independent. Either way, good news or bad news, and we could deal with both. I think that the group chaired by Lord Alderdice had the same credibility because it had the right people on it. It had Dick Kerr from the United States, had John Grieve, a very successful counter-terrorism officer from London, etc. So it had the right people on it. And the public gave it a gravitas it deserved because they were very open with what they found. My job in these situations was to give them all the information I possibly could. And that's what we did in any event. We never said no to any group that wanted to come and talk to us, be they statutory or non-statutory. I'd have groups of self-appointed American lawyers would arrive every parade's commission, every parade, every 12th of July to write a report on how we did on the parade. On occasions I was convinced they'd written the reports before they turned up. That wasn't really the point. The point was I would of course see them, so they could never say I refused to see them. And we would tell them whatever we could tell them. And we had Keir Starmer, who you may remember, you may know him, you may have heard of him. He was the policing board's advisor on our human rights record with Jane Gordon, completely independent. And I remember when he first came to see me, and I just said, look here, you can go wherever you want, whenever you want. It would not be unusual to see Keir Starmer sitting in a gold control room when Duncan McCausland was dealing with a full-blown riot. He wouldn't interfere, he would just record with Jane. You would see the chair of a policing board, or even Dennis, I think on occasions might turn up. They never interfered, they just saw what we were doing. So I think the role of the police is to make that information available. As a chief, or an ex-chief, I'm very comfortable having independent groups with the right qualifications making the judgment. And I think it does move on. I went to Columbia, not that, well, it was a long time ago now, on the sort of on the peace process stuff, on policing, and didn't last very long because my observation was you really need a civilian police service, at which point we were told politely to leave on the grounds, of course, they have a military police service under the command of the Minister of Defence. He wasn't very pleased with the suggestion that he might lose half his staff. But yeah, that's the point. The point was we told them what we would do, and then they made a judgment.
I mean, that's such a great answer, and it's specific to policing. The idea that you should share what you can, and you can't when it compromises sources and methods that you need to use later on. But that compass point about you keep it. If it's in the public interest, you keep it quiet. Not if it's in the police's interest is really important. I'm going to move beyond policing, though, to just a bit more broadly about the shifting attitudes about keeping intelligence, under wraps. I mean, CIA Director Bill Burns took the whole CIA with him on the decision to release all of that intelligence before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And the mantra through my whole career was protect sources and methods, protect sources and methods. And I've checked back in to see, has there been a revolt? And the answer is not at all. That this was this idea that he brought his troops with him, and they agreed that bringing this into the public domain was the most powerful way to use the intelligence. We've been leaked repeatedly, right? Mm-hmm. WikiLeaks, and then Snowden, the mother of all leaks. And the idea that what we collect in that space is going to stay in that space is one that I've been questioning for a long time, because I think that we're vulnerable to hacking. So I think that the idea of hiding behind things, being secret, it's wearing down a bit, and all my gut instinct is happy about that.
Thank you. Another question I want to make sure I get on this side as well. So Professor English had his hand up first, then there'll be another question near him then.
Thank you, Peter. Richard English from the Mitchell Institute, and thanks very much to Dr. Stephenson and to Sir Hugh for fascinating reflections from which I've learned a lot. I've got a question for each of you. For Barbara, the question relates to what you said about the tremendous success of police reform here in Northern Ireland, but relates specifically to policing in the United States of America, because in recent years there's been very high salience given to the problems that there are in some parts of the States in a very different kind of divided set of communities. But I wonder if there was one thing which your experience and wisdom from Northern Ireland would mean that you would say to police in North Carolina or Florida or wherever, what would that be? And for Sir Hugh, you mentioned attitudes towards policing and perhaps the politicisation of policing in England and Wales, and you've had long experience working in Britain as well as in this part of the UK. It often seems to me that many things that are achieved and learned in Northern Ireland are not noticed as much as they might be in England, Scotland and Wales. Could you say something about the ways in which effective policing here in terms of that politics-policing interface has been or hasn't been or should be or could be more sharply recognised by people in England and Wales particularly? Thanks very much.
I think you can't answer the question about policing in America in a collective way very well, because it's a different story with each police department. If it's a really well-led police department, then you'll get very different outcomes than, if it's not. And so it's not at all. In some places there's been tremendous progress made, and we have a police chief in Durham that I'm so proud of. It's my neighbor's daughter, a black woman who is just knows the Constitution inside and out, and really kind of polices like you, Orde does. So there you go. I'm really proud of that one. And then there are others where, you know, the culture doesn't feel healthy. And so it's a very different story in different places, and leadership does matter. What I would say happened nationally, and I hear people talk about it, is when our military started to draw down from Iraq and Afghanistan, a lot of hardware, military hardware, got transferred to police forces. And when you provide this, you end up, I mean, we had an incident in Fairfax County, Virginia, which is about as upper middle class and orderly as a county gets, where a SWAT team broke into the front door of a man who was doing online betting. Now that just seems excessive to me. I'll turn to Hugh about that. So I think that this excessive militarization across the board, that could really use a huge look at the question of whether you'd be better to have a bonfire with the excessive military equipment rather than continuing to encourage the militarization of police forces across the country. Because I've always been happy to see the policeman because I felt like this person was on my side and would protect me while I was walking the street. And sometimes I'm afraid of police now. And I have to say, when you start to feel that, I think it's a sign. And I bet you if we polled for it, we'd find I'm not the only person that's a little scared.
Yeah, I just pick up on that, and that's a really interesting point, the sort of militarisation of policing. If we give our frontline officers any more equipment, they'll need a wheelbarrow. You know, and it's got to the point now where they have so much kit, it does almost start to alienate them from the public.
Yep.
And if you look at the police reform here, I refused point blank, not that any of us would have supported it, this sort of move towards black roll neck sweaters and, you know, sort of more military type uniforms. And I remember speaking to a sergeant from Surrey. Surrey is probably one of the most peaceful parts of the United Kingdom, one of the lowest crime rates. And it was at a conference, and she said, "Oh, we're getting our combat trousers tomorrow." And I said, "Well, what do you need? Are you going to war?" You know, "Oh no, we're getting combat trousers." And her response to that, which I thought was quite good and quite feisty, was, "Well, you used to wear suits," referring to the traditional police jacket, I think, and top hat. And I said, "Yes, but we used to still catch people wearing those." You know, I mean, it's not what you wear, but it's a mindset thing. So if you go to work and you put on all this kit, and I absolutely get the officer safety bit, I'm not suggesting we put officers at extreme risk, but it would, during my time, officers patrolling Belfast were more traditionally dressed than officers patrolling Guildford in Surrey, which has a risk factor of -20. You know, and as a consequence, because I used to be in Belfast a lot, I'd always take an interest in what officers were doing. You would see them walking around looking like someone who was approachable. And the moment you lose that contact, the rest becomes irrelevant. You have as many SWAT teams in the world, you don't get the intelligence because the public don't trust you. Okay. And during our time there, the police board surveys, nothing to do with the police service, their survey showed this upward trend of confidence in policing and this consistent downward trend of crime. And they're connected. It's the connectivity between the citizen and the police officer, which goes back to 1829, but was seen as so important. I've now forgotten my part of the question, which was politics, wasn't it? Politics and policing. And the difference between here and United Kingdom and the rest of the UK, well, there's a fundamental one, which I think drives everything else. The one here is the Chief Constable here, and we're now about 4 or 5 Chief Constables since I was here, I think now, I lose track, is held to account by a board of 19 people who represent the communities they police because of the Hunt principle, and are supported by unelected people with expertise that can add value to policing. And all the meetings are held, I think there's a legal minimum of 8 or 10 a year. We used to go every month. And there's all sorts of subcommittees underneath it at which police officers attend, and if they don't attend, can be summoned to attend, because that's what the law says. So it's a far more vigorous structure and a far more broadly drawn one. So what you don't get is, if the rest of the United, if you compare that to the rest of the UK, you have one person elected. There are no longer any independent police and crime. There were at the very beginning, that was doomed to fail over time. So where I live in Sussex, if the Conservative Party choose to put a cabbage up, the cabbage will get elected. If the Labour Party choose to put a cabbage up in Manchester, that person will be elected. So what you've got now is people supported by political parties being directly in charge of policing. And if one looks at how politics has gone in this country in a way which I would argue is downhill, that becomes very complex, and it makes it very difficult for a chief, because the chief is there at the grace and favour of that one individual. Whereas to get rid of me here would take, well, I'm sure he could have done, but I've got 19 people who have had to have agreed that I should go. It's a different structure. And from that is born everything else. So I was very comfortable here that my local officers are being held to account by a broad base at the local level, and I was being held to account at the top level. And no one, which goes, I think, probably the quality of people, no one ever tried to influence me from a political perspective. I fully understood what my officers were doing would have a political consequence, but that was for them to manage. I think in other parts of the UK now, it's all become very muddled. And the notion that a police officer is independent has become somewhat confused and is now argued. Although no one has ever challenged the judgment I referred to earlier in any legal way. It has never been challenged successfully. So the fact that the police only answer to the law is a matter of fact, but of course in the reality of the human interactions it becomes something fundamentally different.
So there was a question near to Professor English there, a hand up there.
Hi, my name's Catherine Cribbin. I'm a PhD candidate here at Queen's. My question is for you, Sir Hugh. During the Troubles, a lot of the conversations around policing and politics often referred to the fact that there was a perception that An Garda Síochána refused or was uncooperative with members of the RUC. Whilst that was before your time, I was wondering what your experience of working with the Guards was.
Thanks. Well, I can only speak as I find. One of the first, in fact, my first visit, just before I got the job, was an invitation from the then Commissioner Pat Byrne to come and meet him in Dublin, which of course I took up. And I had the pleasure of working with 3 commissioners during my time, Faulkner Murphy and Noel Conroy, after Pat. And they were all very good. And it's a very different force, it's a very different structure, you have to accept that, it's a different country. But I never had anything other than full support. Plus, interestingly, it's an observation that may sound slightly flippant, but it's not meant to be. Plus, I got invited to every Irish rugby match in my time here. And I always went. And I went because at every Irish international is the whole of the Irish political community, from the Lord Chief Justice, the President, downwards. And one could have conversations. And that was hugely important. It was what I used to call quiet conversations. I had lots of quiet conversations here. When Sinn Féin hadn't joined the policing board, I had lots of quiet conversations in various places with Sinn Féin members, just talking about policing and how we could move this world on, things that should never be made public in the sense of you would cause embarrassment to those who were trying to move the world on, but they were very useful conversations. And I had very useful conversations down south as well, all of which I think were positive in terms of the consequence, in terms of policing both sides of the border. I relied on them to keep my people safe on many occasions, and they never let us down. Police officers over here are without question, or atrocities over here were not committed because of intelligence we got from An Garda Síochána. So it was a very positive relationship the whole time I was there. In fact, when I retired, it was one of the other jobs I was given I was asked to do was to actually help select the Deputy Commissioner of An Garda Síochána, which I was delighted to do. So I think it's a critical relationship. It was always going to be a critical relationship. For all the reasons I've articulated, but it was around making sure the island of Ireland was safe. They faced huge challenges like we face, and the public domain, there's lots of issues that the An Garda Síochána are facing now under the leadership of one of my ex-chief officers, which says a lot in its own right, actually. But it was one of the things I was worried about, and it was one of the things I should never have been worried about.
So all really important questions on policing there, and I want to make sure, hopefully I can say, Ambassador Stephenson, as well, questions about maybe the US role broadly, but I think there was a hand up here as well. But yes, as I say, questions on the US broadly would be welcome, if that's okay. Please.
My name's Fergal McFerrin from the Children's Law Centre. I wanted to just reflect, because it was kind of touched upon, obviously in the 98 agreement, equality and human rights had a profound role in what was agreed, and in policing reform, human rights were obviously given their focus too. And I wondered if we could reflect a little bit more about that and why it was important, particularly in the context of, particularly maybe in Westminster at the moment, where there's a growing narrative of human rights as these meddlesome things that stop us from taking decisions or doing the things we want to, why it was important at the time and why it remains important now.
You go first?
You go.
Okay. Well, it's very simple. There is an obligation for a police service to operate within the constraints of the Human Rights Act and all legislation around the rights of citizens. And my operating principle was always that a successful police service is one that had interfered with the rights of citizens only when absolutely essential. Minimum use of force, maximum respect for human rights was a sort of byword, I suppose, for how we would go about how we operated. Historically, the human rights-based approach to policing was seen as a sort of, how can you be a good cop if you comply with human rights? Well, you can only be a good cop if you comply with human rights, and we proved that's how we did our business. And again, back to pattern, not my ideas at all, but the whole training regime was all based on a human rights-based approach to policing. The various articles were learnt by our staff. It was something that was seen as the starting point. And if you're training 400 officers a year, which we were at the time, 50% Catholic, 50% non-Catholic, as the legislation so described, you're very quickly getting that sort of approach out onto the front line of policing. So, if you do the math, as they say, in 7 years, that's an awful lot of frontline officers and people going up. Plus, of course, the notion that the officers already employed were doing anything other than complying is a false one. And, of course, again, under pattern, everyone had 2 days training in how the world was going to be. So the conditions were created by the wisdom of the report. Our job, again, was to make sure it happened. But every single officer, including the hard-to-reach ones, did those 2 days training, including my whole chief officer team and me, and they were very tough because it gave everyone an opportunity to say how hurt they felt. They'd been an RUC officer for 20 years, and all of a sudden they were doing exactly the same job in exactly the same way, and they were called something else. That can be painful, but they had the opportunity to go through that in a very well managed and invigilated way. And then come out the other side and then talk about the code of ethics, talk about how we would continue to do policing. So the learning for me was you can't just say, we've got a human rights-based approach. It's got to actually mean something, which means you've got to invest very heavily in training, and you've got to invest very heavily in making sure people understand what it means. And I think the challenge police officers, the chiefs have now, is I had money. I had not limitless funding, but I had top cover in terms of the Prime Minister of the time, Blair, was quite interested in Northern Ireland. It was very much his thing. We had a direct line to Treasury for the reform process as recommended by Patten. And with that sort of leverage, I had the resources to deliver. I'm not persuaded, currently, any police service has the resources to deliver. The numbers have dropped, there's talk of massive recruiting now. But the other thing we learned very early on was the more you invest in getting the right people across the threshold, the more likely you are to have a successful police service. And again, recruiting was hugely important to us. It was outsourced. But we had the right raw material from both communities. We never dropped a standard anywhere. We had a proper assessment process, so it was very expensive. So to get one officer across the threshold of a police service of Northern Ireland training school was somewhere in the region, I think, don't remind me, £3,500 per officer. But my view was that's a 35-year investment. As a consequence, I would argue, our retention rate was very high. We hardly lost anyone at training school because they had the intellectual ability, the interpersonal skills and communications, because we'd tested it all. And they went on, some are now very senior officers across the country. So it's about investing, and it's about not seeing human rights as a threat, but an opportunity.
Ambassador, did you want to make any comment on that kind of human rights agenda?
I just think that was a great answer.
I can't afford this.
I'm going to have to be careful of the time here as well, so regrettably, folks, I'm going to have to make this the very last question. So there's a question here at the front here, please.
Thank you. Chris Todd, currently the Deputy Chief Constable. Chief Constable John Boucher can't be here this evening. He would give his apologies. He was just trying to call me, actually. I didn't take the call because I thought that would be rude. But he was probably, did you say this was online at the moment? Yeah. So he was probably watching online, and he's probably calling to tell me to ask you a question about money. I like the idea of the influential conversations over the rugby and influence in those spaces. So with a predicted funding gap of 140 million for the year ahead, and now our police officer numbers, let alone police staff, sitting at about 2,000 short of what the current evidence base would suggest would be our right number of police officers. Where should we be having those soft conversations to influence either in the US or the UK that we're currently missing?
I'm sure Barbara will talk about the American experience. This is the biggest issue facing UK policing at the moment. Demand seems to be relentless and increasing. The requirement of police to act, in so many different areas that we never used to operate in at all, be it, quite properly need to operate in now, but we never did. Inevitably means it's going to cost more money, and that's precisely what we don't have. I think the conversations need to be at the highest level of government. Frankly, it was easy for me here. I was pushing on open door. Even when, the most awful event, I remember very clearly when Stevie Carroll was murdered, Gordon Brown came over and we showed him the video because the Mazarine barracks was just before that when Azimkar, Sappers Azimkar and Quincy were murdered by distant Republican terrorists. So clearly this was a crisis of some measure. I suppose the difference in a way here is people understand very quickly that the peace process is still fragile in the sense that these things can go backwards as quickly as they can go forwards. And the moment you take a key element out, policing in this case, out of the overall activity around maintaining a stable environment, you are in a very bad place that could cost billions to put right. So my view is it absolutely is a matter for the most senior levels of government. I would like to think, and in my time in ACPO, when I had the privilege of representing chief officers with government, I was about as successful there as I was in Colombia, to be honest, because if government sets its mind, not against the police in that sense, it sets its mind that we have sufficient resources and it will not be persuaded otherwise, however scientific the evidence is, you have a huge problem. But it's going to have to be a relentless pressure and describing a problem in stark terms, and that may be in public terms, and this is back to my original point that many chief officers feel constrained about what they can say because of the political dynamic that now operates in policing. I think it's different here. And of course here, if I remember rightly, I would take a budget for policing. In fact, we would spend 2 days with the police board discussing the budget. And then the police board would take the budget to government to say, here's what we need. And if it hasn't changed, then the police board and the chief need to continue to batter the door down. If I'm honest, I don't hold a huge amount of hope for any police service trying to get a substantial increase in its budget, anything like what they need to deliver. But policing is but a very small percentage of overall government expenditure. It's tiny, it's a matter of a couple of percent or whatever it is. But the government's first responsibility is the safety of the citizen. And I failed when I was president of ACPO to get that message across in a way that it was understood. And during my time in ACPO, you saw the police services, more than decimated in terms of the cutbacks during the financial crisis. And you don't recover from that quickly. As you know, a lot of experience walked out the door. And relentless political pressure to recruit quickly is also fundamentally flawed. You need to recruit carefully. And that takes more time, and people have to hold their nerve in the meantime. So I don't have an easy answer to that one. It is, I think, the biggest challenge currently facing policing is the resource issue and the expectation issue. And it's probably magnified here because of the operating environment in which you work. And for the Chief Constable to leave the country knowing I was coming is unforgivable.
Ambassador, might that question be tweaked a little? It's same in diplomacy, that the most important resources are the people, are the personnel, the people you work with. Surely this is the key thing.
And I was listening to you, Hugh, and thinking about, the diplomatic corps back home, and we went through a huge hiring freeze, which we're now trying to compensate for by hiring at numbers like we've never seen. And it just, it really weakens an institution that requires very steady intake of very high quality people that move through the ranks in an orderly fashion. And when it gets caught up in the political winds, which our diplomatic service very, very much has, it has a deeper political penetration by a huge factor than any other institution at the federal government. And it really causes these swings between administrations of no hiring and then big hiring. And over time, it takes a huge toll on institutions we really want to be able to count on.
And you can't just turn the tap on and turn the tap off.
You can't.
And, and that's the issue. And if you look at some of the, and then when you turn the tap back on, if you recruit the wrong people, then you create this huge issue. And many of well-rehearsed story. And why is competence in policing falling in the United Kingdom now? It's events. It's an individual, be it the Everard case or one of the, many cases that are sort of bubbling about at the moment. That's what really impacts on public confidence. And one likes to think the more you can minimise that by getting the right people in, by spending a lot of money up front to make sure you get the right recruits, which is where I think we were a real success in this organisation, the better. But that's not the real world in which current chiefs are operating.
Folks, as I said before, regrettably, we're out of time here. I'm sure there will be further questions to follow. I certainly had more, but I have a few thanks that I want to offer out firstly. First of all, to everybody who was involved in organising this event, both at the RUC-GC Foundation, so particularly Michael and Stephen, please pass on my great thanks to him as well. A number of colleagues here at Queen's, far too many to mention, but particularly colleagues at the Mitchell Institute and Professor Richard English as director, and also Susan and Maurice McCartney, who you'd seen going around with the microphones there, but that also have been the key people behind this for the last few weeks, really doing all the hard work. So I'm really, really grateful to them as well. I thank you all once again for coming and for your contributions, for your interesting questions. I hope you found it as an enjoyable a conversation as I have. And I want to end, as traditional, in thanking our guests, not just for the conversation we've had this evening, but certainly, in my opinion, the fact that they played such a crucial role in the place we are in Northern Ireland today. And it's not perfect, but it's an awful lot further on along the road in terms of improvement and the environment in which we can teach our students today and the next people who will take these challenging roles on. So I want to thank them for that, thank them for their time this evening, and I hope the audience will join me in the traditional way with a round of applause, please.